Point Pleasant, West Virginia, 1966, a strange winged figure with glowing red eyes appeared in the night. Locals called it the Mothman, an omen, a monster, or something stranger. For 13 months, sightings terrorized a community, until tragedy struck with the collapse of the Silver Bridge. Tonight, we tell the story of the Mothman, a family of witnesses, a town on edge, and a legend that fused folklore with fear. If you find this story gripping, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's begin. The town sits where two great bodies of water meet, the Kanawha running out of the hills, the Ohio rolling broad and metallic toward the Mississippi. Together they make a V of currents and fog, a place where barges mutter at night and the air can feel older than the buildings that cling to it. In the mid-1960s, Point Pleasant wasn't a crossroads so much as a holding place, a river town of storefronts with slanted awnings, linoleum floors, and brass bells that announced every visitor by habit. There were diners that served coffee too dark and pie too sweet, a couple of barbers, a bowling alley, and a courthouse whose steps felt like the center of the world for anyone who lived within 10 miles of the bridge. By day, the town's pulse moved with the industry of the valley, freight along the tracks, coal and chemicals shipped by river, the regular clearing of factory whistles. By night, it dimmed to porch lights and the sound of the river working at its banks. The economy had already started to slope downward, not in a dramatic collapse but in the slow way a hillside gives after weeks of rain. Men noticed fewer shifts posted, more talk of layoffs. Teenagers learned that, maybe you'll have to move, was not a threat but a prediction. And overlaying all of it was the Cold War, those televised maps with red arrows pointing like spears, the drills that made children curl under desks as if wood and gum would hold back a flash of light, the low, private arithmetic adults did about how many cans belonged in a basement. If you walked out of town toward the low marshes, you would eventually find the place locals still called the TNT area, part wildlife preserve now, part ruin. During World War II, the US government constructed a munitions plant there, a landscape of concrete igloos half sunk into the earth, capped with grass, dimpled like burial mounds for some modern tribe. After the war, the plant went quiet, the structures left to the animals and to anyone bold or bored enough to roam. The roads broke, weeds rose and split the asphalt, and the bunkers became echo chambers where even a whisper came back as an accusation. At twilight, the place turned uncanny, reeds shook with hidden life, ponds filmed over with a chemical sheen, and the wind made a thin, tinny sound as it passed through busted vents. 100 small noises stitched together into the sense that something was moving just out of sight. Appalachia has always been a place that understands stories in the dark. Old-timers on stoops told of witch lights flitting over hollows, of phantom dogs that barked at nothing, of river things that surfaced in silence and sank like a secret. Point Pleasant's own folklore included a curse. In the 1770s, Shawnee leader Cornstalk, captured and later killed at the fort, was said to have marked the land with sorrow as he died, a story passed down with varying details but a fixed mood, as if grief could be inherited through soil. Whether anyone claimed to believe it out loud hardly mattered. Curses are a way to give shape to patterns, and the people here knew that misfortune often traveled in families, in towns, in lines you could trace with a finger along a map. The shape of the place made a listening post of it. In fall, fog comes up off the water and crosses the bridge like a congregation. In winter, ice forms in scallops along the river's edge, and the barges push through with a sound like dead trees snapping. The bridge itself, the Silver Bridge, strung Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, with a confidence that seemed modern, even glamorous, compared to the brick storefronts and clapboard houses. The bridge took you across the river to jobs, to relatives, to Sunday drives. It was as common and as essential as breath. Everyone trusted it without thinking about the steel. In such a town, strangers stood out, and so did anything that wouldn't resolve itself into an everyday explanation. People here were practical, but practicality doesn't erase the imagination, it only fences it. When the sun went down and the river inhaled a layer of mist, those fences felt low. Your headlights would pick up flurries of insects beyond the marshes, and sometimes the light would catch the eye shine of something in the brush and twitch it into a story before you could slow down and see it was only a raccoon. Only a deer. Only a trick of the angle. But that is how it begins, with a line of sight out into dark acreage, with the sense that the borders of your town stop at the water but the night does not. The TNT area drew teenagers because it felt lawless. They went there to park, to prove something, to feel the circle of their headlights around the mouth of a bunker and laugh too loud at the echo. Hunters went because game was thick in the reeds. Fishermen tried the sluggish ponds because they swore they'd seen ripples roll and rock like something turning beneath. In the daylight, the structures looked merely abandoned. By starlight, they looked like the afterimage of a war. If you pressed your ear to the cold concrete, you could hear the blood in your head and pretend it was a machine waking. The place tutored people in the art of looking over a shoulder. Local newspapers reported the practical metrics of the town, employment figures, council meetings, football scores. But tucked in the classifieds, or mentioned after church, were small notices about oddities, a rash of missing dogs near the fields, a farmer who said his cattle acted spooked by nothing, a letter to the editor about strange lights low and slow over the river as if a plane had lost its mind. These were the kinds of reports that never rose to headlines but circulated by mouth. Did you hear about? Someone would start, and before the story's end, the speaker would shrug, embarrassed at the scale of what they'd suggested. People wanted there to be reasons. They wanted the tremor in the night to be just a truck on a distant road. The roads in and out carried the restlessness of the decade, the country arguing with itself about war and race and the promises of modern life. On television, everything appeared in neat lines, anchors calm, maps clear, the future packaged. But just off Route 62, the world was not tidy. The woods pressed close, the sky felt low, and half a mile from town you could stand alone and not hear another human sound. In that kind of quiet, small noises get promoted. A branch snaps and pulls a heartbeat with it. An owl's cry turns metallic, alien. It's easy, standing on the broken concrete of an old munitions bunker, to sense that history leaves residue, that the wartime manufacture of explosives has its own ghost, one you catch only in the periphery. Point Pleasant's churches were steady and full on Sundays. The men bowed their heads, the women sang steady harmonies, the children stared at stained glass that made the river outside look like poured fire. Faith here was not shouted but worn. It gave people language for suffering and for the strange. When talk of omens came up later, it did not arrive in a vacuum. The idea that the world could announce itself through signs was not foreign. It had always been part of the way the hills breathed. Even the town's layout seemed to anticipate a visitation. The main street drew you toward the river, toward the bridge, toward what lay beyond. At dusk the storefront windows turned mirror dark, and if you walked by, you could see yourself crossed with the reflection of the current. The sense, faint but insistent, was that the town faced outward, waiting. This is not to make Point Pleasant superstitious, or uniquely fragile. It was a normal place and proud of it. But normal places are where legends take root best, because the contrast is sharper. You expect strange stories from strange territories, you don't expect them from the sidewalk you sweep every morning. So when the first sighting came, it landed in soil already aerated by uncertainty, economic, political, and personal. When fear arrived, it found a culture with folklore at hand and a landscape with cover to spare. If you had listened closely in October 1966, you might have heard all the instruments tuning, the economy's souring note, the damp hush of the marshlands, the hush of a town that looks ordinary until you sit in it long enough to hear the old stories click into place. There was nothing yet to name. Only this, the sense that the river kept a memory, that the fog might carry a figure with it, that two red points could rise out of the dark like coals and fix you in place. And then, in November, fear found a shape for its wings. It began without ceremony, a shovel, a patch of earth, and a sky the color of wet slate. On the evening of November 12, 1966, a crew of gravediggers were at work near Clendenin, a small cemetery on a rise where the map looks like a wrinkle in the land. The light had gone thin and blue. They were talking in the way working men do, about nothing, about everything, when a shadow passed over them and drew their heads up in the same instant. What they remembered later felt impossible to reconcile with their own common sense, a man-shaped figure with wings, broad and dark, swooping silently across the cemetery and then away into the trees, as if it had launched from the tree line and decided, for one brief moment, to take a measure of the living. They looked at each other the way people do who have just shared a secret that they didn't ask for. A joke frayed on someone's lips and fell apart. One of them swore, another made a gesture that was half a cross and half a ward against bad luck. They talked themselves back toward reason, crane, great horned owl, trick of angle, and went home carrying a story that did not fit any pocket they owned. 3 days later, November 15, fate decided that one uncertain tale wasn't enough. Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Millette, two couples, young and wired with the freedom of a late drive, coasted along the serpentine roads near the old TNT area. The world there is a collage, broken slabs of wartime concrete, water pooling into dead-calm rectangles, weeds with burrs like hooks. The couples were not hunting ghosts, they were, by every account, doing what people their age have always done, driving, laughing, daring the dark to do something about it. The creature announced itself with eyes first. Not the soft reflected gold of a deer or the brittle white of a raccoon caught wrong in a headlight, but red, hot, polished, deliberate. They saw a shape taller than any man, with wings folded tight against a torso that seemed too broad, and they felt a drop in their stomachs that arrived before the mind could label it fear. They would say later that it walked in a wrong way, a loping, heavy step that carried no sound, that when it unfolded its wings, the air around the car felt different, a pressure change like the moment before a storm breaks. They did what frightened people do, they ran. The driver threw the car into a turn, tires biting at gravel, and the road unspooled in a ribbon of pale asphalt toward Route 62. The creature rose. In the rearview mirror the two red points held like coals. The car's engine climbed, and the speedometer jumped, 70, 80, 90, the needle threatening the end of its arc. The couples would later insist they hit 100 miles an hour, and still, it kept up. It did not flap the way birds flap, it seemed to glide, a dark geometry holding pace, swooping close enough for the passengers to feel watched. Go, someone said, voice over the engine's scream. Go, go. They hit town like a gust, the creature fell away at the edge of light, and they reached the safe geometry of streets and storefronts as if they had broken the surface of water. It took minutes for breath to return to their lungs in what felt like the normal rhythm of breathing. Even then, while hands were still shaking, there was a decision: call the police. The story would no longer be a private trespass of the mind. At the station, faces turned toward the door in the same skeptical way faces always turn toward a tall tale. But the couple's insistence, their lack of theatrics, the kind of two quick sentences people speak when they are trying to reconstruct something that has frightened them, this shifted the room. An officer who knew them, who had known them for years, saw there was no prank here, no dare gone too far. They drove back out together, patrol lights washing the world red and blue, to see what could be found. What they found was stillness. The marshes held their breath. The wind traced the vents of the concrete igloos and made its thin, metallic sound. The officer shone his light on scratches along a doorframe, pointed out the chalky dust of old concrete as if it held an answer. He filed a report, because that is what is done, but in the report's language, detailed, dutiful, there was no place for the quiver in the air, no space for the way four voices tripped over each other, agreeing even when words failed. By morning, it had migrated to newsprint. A world that had been private for a dozen people was now public. The story changed clothes as it moved, a large bird, something like a man with wings, red eyes. A lawman gave the practical answer, a kind of bird, surely, but practical answers often arrive like bandages over wounds that are still bleeding. Headlines needed a hook, the era offered one. In a time when the Batman television show soaked the culture with caped shadows, a reporter reached for an easy rhyme, Mothman. The name stuck like a burr. Names are powerful. They take a vague dread and give it a costume. The thing seen by torching nerves became something you could talk about at breakfast without losing your appetite. The couple's account still shivered when told aloud, they had felt its nearness, They had heard a sound like muffled wings, they had seen red eyes that didn't reflect so much as regard, but the town could now tag that dread and move it along a circuit of conversation. "Did you hear about the Mothman?" a clerk asked as he slid a bag of nails across a counter. A teacher overcorrected her tone, probably just a crane, and checked the clock to see how far from dusk she was. A child drew something with wings in the tight corner of a notebook and shaded the eyes too dark. The couples returned to the roads during daylight to prove to themselves that the world still lay there in its proper order. The marsh water shone like cut metal. The bunker mouths sat black and circular, mouths that would always look like mouths. Someone had nailed a cross to a tree, as if specifics helped. It is human to rewalk the ground where fear has taken hold, to map it again, to look into bushes, to point at distances and say the words we have. It was there, it turned from there, it was that tall. They talked about the sound, or the lack of it, how the creature's movement seemed to steal noise out of the air, how even the engine had sounded strangled in its presence. Skeptics arrived, as they do, with the gifts of taxonomy. Sandhill crane, they said, big enough, red patch around the eyes. Or, barred owl, eyes reflecting a demonic red in the right angle of headlight. The couples listened, grateful for any reasonable salvation. But then the crane's wingspan didn't quite measure against what they had seen, and the owl's flight didn't match the near **** horizontal chase *** that kept pace with a speedometer's panic. Those who had been in the car returned again and again to the eyes, not because they were lurid, but because they felt intentional. "It looked at us," one of them said. It looked. A night or two later, a mother living near the TNT area phoned the police to say there was something in her yard. Her dog had gone wild, barking then whining, and when she flicked on the outside light the world seemed to contract around the warm square of the doorway. The yard ended in weeds, then in a band of brush, and just beyond that, she swore, something stood. She stayed on the phone with the operator and described it in fits: height, wings, eyes. When the patrol car pulled up, the yard was a yard again. The dog pressed close to her leg, shuddering with a dog's memory. A small, human pattern began. Phone calls to the station at odd hours, a deputy's flashlight combing the dark, descriptions that didn't fit into the margins of any form. The local paper gathered what it could and printed what would fit. Someone called the station just to say they had dreamed of a great black shape over the river, and that they woke with their heart doing the long fall of a bridge with no bottom. Dreams aren't evidence. The operator made a polite sound and set the receiver down gently. But when she raised her eyes to the station's window, the night beyond felt thicker than before. The four from November 15 became, unwillingly, the town's witnesses. Strangers asked them to retell the chase like a party trick. Some rolled their eyes, some leaned too far forward, hungry. The couples tried to be consistent, and consistency became its own kind of prison. If a detail shifted by a hair's breadth, if the memory refracted under pressure, someone would pounce. The cost of telling the truth is that truth-speaking has to live in the same room with skepticism forever. A few nights later, one of the couples doubled back to the TNT area with friends. Strength in numbers is an ancient strategy. They parked near a bunker and sat with the engine off. The night pressed. For a long time there was nothing, just a rustle, a distant owl, the cold chewing at the edges of their jackets. And then a shadow detached itself from the dark, a shape that rose from the bunker roof as if it had been bedded down there and was, with some irritation, waking. The car erupted into shouts that were half laughter and half terror, human sound so loud it made its own kind of fog. The creature lifted without the labor of flapping, coasted across them, and fell away at an angle that felt like a choice, not a reaction. They didn't tell the paper that bit. Not right away. Keeping a piece of the story back felt like a way to own it again. The sheriff gave a statement to the effect that people were seeing something, yes, and that birds could look mighty strange in headlights at night. There was no appetite, in a practical office with an American flag and a coffee pot that tasted like metal, for the word monster. But the calls kept coming. Mothman had moved past naming, it had entered the choreography of the town's nights. Every rumble in a barn, every squall of wind in a stand of trees, became suspect. The press loved the rhythm of the chase, the 100-mile-an-hour sprint down Route 62, the idea of a creature pacing a car like a hunter who doesn't yet need to strike. That image traveled fast, farther than Point Pleasant, as images do that seem tailor-made for a certain American paranoia. In the larger world, men in suits talked about missiles and maps. In this smaller world, young people talked about how it felt to be prey on a road they had driven since they were old enough to borrow a car. In living rooms, conversations ended with someone glancing toward a window as if it might unfold, like a set of wings, into another fate. At the grocery, an elderly woman told the clerk she had seen red lights bobbing near the river, only to retract it a second later, embarrassed. In the school parking lot, a boy said he'd spotted something on a rooftop. 2 others laughed, then walked home faster than usual when the early dark wanted company. What the couples had done, without wanting to, was open a door. Whatever walked or flew through would do so on its own schedule. Stories are like that, especially the ones told by people who would rather not be telling them. And the name the paper had given the thing worked like a key. Even people who didn't believe in Mothman began to think in its outline at the edges of night. The town took a breath, and the breath did not fully release. The name stuck, and so did the fear, as more sightings poured in. The week after the TNT chase, Point Pleasant discovered how quickly a town can learn to listen for a single sound. In the evenings, conversation sank toward that subject the way a house tilts toward a river. People reported red eyes where eyes should not be, wings where wings had no right to be, motion where there should have been only the ordinary stillness of winter fields. The sheriff's office started keeping a separate stack of incident slips, a small, beige archive of dread. By Thanksgiving, the pattern had a rhythm. Drivers on back roads said a shape would lift out of a ditch and pace the car, holding a line just beyond the beam, then tilting up and away at an angle that made the hair lift along the arms. Several reported that when they reached to adjust the radio, the dial went to static and would not be coaxed back. A pair of teenagers said the dashboard lights flickered and died outright for a breath or two while the figure passed over their windshield, a sensation like being dipped and raised by something larger than wind. On rooftops it appeared as a hunched silhouette, a geometry that felt wrong against the tidy square of shingles, too tall for a person, too spare for a vulture. A grocer's assistant, walking home after closing, saw it crouched on the corner of a hardware store, one knee cocked as if it were studying the streetlight. When he stopped, it turned, not the head alone but the entire upper body, and the red points in its face found him. He discovered the particular fear that enters through the throat, making speech a clumsy instrument. He could not even form the ordinary oath a person might give the dark. He blundered into motion and did not look back until he reached his own porch. By then there was only the roofline and the night. In the farm belt beyond the marshes, animals began to vanish. A boy mourned a hound that didn't return, a dairy farmer found a calf gone from a fenced lot without a break in the wire. Chickens turned up torn without the telltale mess of fox work, as if something had tested them and lost interest. The stories braided with details that did not make sense on their own, low keening in the trees just before midnight, sulfur in the air around the igloo doors, a whistle like steam escaping, though no machine there had been hot for 20 years. Parents patrolled porch edges with flashlights, the beams jittering on frost. A man who owned a service station reported to the sheriff that during a night watch his engine, a reliable straight 6, stalled 3 times when he pointed his truck toward the TNT roads, then ran again when he turned toward town. He opened the hood by instinct, as if frightened circuitry could be soothed by a wrench, and found nothing wrong that could be named. He shut the hood with a clack that sounded final but settled nothing. Then came the family stories, the ones that made Mothman not a distant headline but a houseguest. A woman living with her mother and 2 children at the edge of the wildlife area said that for 3 nights running, something visited. They heard it first as a scrape along the siding and a thump above the kitchen, measured and slow, like a big man negotiating an unfamiliar roof. On the 4th night, the mother, braver than she felt, snapped the porch light on and stepped forward until the light laid a white rectangle across the yard. There, past the pumpkin vines, a shape stood. The wings were not open, but the suggestion of them was there, folded against a frame that did not belong to any animal she knew. They did what people sometimes do when the mind stalls, they waved it away, as if shooing a stray dog. The thing did not move, the eyes were steady, hot as the ends of cigarettes. When the porch bulb popped, throwing the family backward into sudden dark, the youngest child began to cry without noise. The next day the family called an uncle and asked him to sit 2 nights in a row. He did, shotgun across his knees, and saw nothing. Faith and fatigue kept the house together. The sheriff granted interviews with the same caution he used on river ice. He acknowledged a flurry of calls. He was careful with language, unusual bird activity, unidentified figure, no evidence of threat to the public. The words did their best to press the experience into a safer shape. But the calls kept coming. A schoolteacher, sensible to a fault, told her sister she had seen it standing on the shoulder of Route 2 in the fog at dawn, motionless as if waiting to be collected. When a truck groused past, it tilted its head not toward the noise but toward the cab, as if considering the driver in particular. The teacher drove 10 miles before she noticed she was crying. Another night, a pair of lovers parked near an igloo felt the roof of their car depress, as if a large weight had settled on it. The interior went smaller by a foot on all sides. The boy turned the key and felt that dead, stupid silence of a motor that refuses to join the world. He hit the key again with a prayer disguised as profanity. Nothing. Then came the flutter, no, not a flutter, something like heavy cloth unfolding in a stairwell. The roof rose slack by an inch, then lifted free. The engine caught on the 3rd try and pulled them out of the event as if dragging a net. Radio talk shows from Charleston and Huntington began to book Point Pleasant callers, and what had been a local rumor stretched along the valley. Some callers were deliberate story benders, you could hear the relish in their pauses. But others sounded like men and women reading notes to themselves, trying to keep a chronology from unraveling: time, place, weather, direction of travel. One man said he had seen it hover, not exactly fly, hover like a kite in dirty wind, except there was no string anchoring it to sense. Another swore that when it passed over his car's roof, the CB went from music to a voice he did not recognize saying syllables that felt like numbers or names. The show's host chuckled and moved them along, the tape spooled on. The skeptics sharpened their tools. They brought field guides to the diner and read aloud. Sandhill cranes, wingspan 6 to 7 feet, red facial skin, check. Great horned owls, eye shine that can read red to human view, territorial posture that might look like standing, check. They held up photographs and said, look. Look, this is what you saw. The believing witnesses didn't turn hostile, they turned tired. They were not asking strangers to believe in monsters, they were asking them to believe that something had happened that did not dissolve in the solvent of a taxonomy. A volunteer fireman brought up the igloos themselves, reminding anyone within earshot that those concrete mounds were threaded with vents and shafts, the sort of broken architecture that can manufacture odd noises, weird drafts, even turbulence that lifts big birds wrong. The explanation felt satisfying the way a diagram satisfies, until someone who had seen the eyes set under a brow spot that was not a beak shook their head and went quiet. Winter put its edge on things. Snow made the roads into chalk lines. The river smoked in the morning. The bridge grew a thin helmet of ice. In that season, the creature felt more visible, not less, because there are fewer moving parts in the world to mask anything else that moves. A police cruiser found tracks near the TNT area, wide and deep in the crust, not boot-shaped, not quite bird-shaped either. The marks followed a ditch, then stopped at an open patch of field with no drift and no tall grass, a place where, if you were telling the story with your hands, you would lift one hand like a plane leaving the runway. December brought an uglier rumor, livestock not just vanished but mutilated. A cattleman showed a deputy a heifer laid out with an almost surgical neatness the man had no words for. The deputy urged him, quietly, not to tell the paper. The man took the advice. He went home and stared at his pasture until his eyes watered. In church basements and living rooms, maps came out. People began drawing little X's where they had heard or seen something: the cemetery out by Clendenin, the drag near the igloos, the section of Route 62 where loved ones swore it paced the car. A cluster of X's gathered like buckshot along the TNT grounds and the roads that billowed away from them. Someone suggested the creature was nesting in one of the igloos. Someone else, eyes bright the way eyes get when fear turns creative, spoke about tunnels under the ground, about old wartime drains that could cradle anything with the patience to hide. A pair of hunters came in with a story about a whirring noise that felt almost electrical passing over their heads before dawn, like a current traveling through air rather than wire. They described a pressure in the sinuses and a taste like a battery on the tongue. When they raised their rifles out of reflex, both men felt too ashamed to take aim at a shape they could not name. They lowered the barrels, stayed still, and listened to a sound the town would try to imitate for the next year: not a flap, not a plane, like cloth being pulled through a narrow place. Neighboring counties began to borrow Point Pleasant's fear. Calls came in from Mason, Gallia, Putnam, a creeping bloom on the map. Many of those calls came at night, and you could hear, under the practical details, the loneliness of a person awake in a dark house inventing and uninventing shapes beside their fence line. The sheriff's office was kind, mostly. "We'll send a car." Sometimes they did, sometimes the car was elsewhere, and a deputy offered a voice and company until the caller said, "It's okay. It's gone." In that season the town's logic divided. In the daylight, people were themselves: they laughed, they stocked shelves, they raked, they adjusted belts, they made fun of their own fear. At night, a threshold opened. Men who did not usually pray found their mouths forming old words. Dogs who barked at everything refused to bark at the one thing their bodies told them to fear, and instead pressed close to their owners and shivered with loyalty and confusion. Even those who did not see it felt it, which is one way a phenomenon migrates from occurrence to culture. It entered the dream life of the valley, and dreams, however private, make themselves public in 100 tiny ways: a mood carried into an office, a hesitation at a stop sign, the new habit of walking under the awning instead of out at the curb, where the sky feels larger. Journalists from out of town arrived in wool coats and stood at the river, shivering, interviewing the cold. They asked leading questions and got uncooperative answers. "You really think you saw a monster?" one asked a witness with the careful sneer of a man who would prefer a performance. "I don't know what I saw," the witness answered, ashamed and stubborn at once. "I know what I felt." The reporter made a note that did not include that last sentence. And still, in all that accumulation, there were the specifics that resist the smoothing hand of story. A state road worker, methodical as a clock, said a shadow paced his truck for half a mile at 35 and then climbed like a thrown coat. A mother driving home from choir saw the reflection of 2 red points in her rear window, which did not make sense, because reflection requires a source and there was no car behind her. A night watchman swore that the generator that never failed went quiet when a bulk passed between him and the security light. The generator coughed back to life exactly as the bulk cleared. He quit a week later and told people it was for his back. The longer the sightings multiplied, the more it seemed as if explanations were the things that needed explaining. Each new classification, crane, owl, prank, hysteria, asterisk asterisk answered asterisk asterisk something and ignored something else. The sum of details refused to balance. Even the skeptics, over pie, let their voices drop when they put down their forks and said, "Still, I wouldn't go out there alone." And as if the town needed a second axis for its dread, another storyline to tangle the first, people began to speak softly of strangers, men in dark suits, in cars without visible plates, who came to porches that no one outside the county had any business finding. They asked careful questions. They smiled in a way that meant nothing at all. They suggested, with a politeness that landed like a threat, that it would be best if people kept quiet. And alongside the creature, came another layer of dread, the men in black. In winter, when the river puts smoke in the morning air and the bridge rings like a tuning fork under truck tires, a second story threaded itself through Point Pleasant, quieter than the winged thing but stranger in its courtesies. It didn't rush at windshields or rake roofs. It knocked. They came in twos sometimes, or alone, which felt worse. Dark suits, hats despite the fashion having moved on, shoes that looked too new for the kind of roads they had to take to find these porches. Their cars, if anyone looked closely enough to trade notes later, were immaculate in a way the valley's roads didn't permit, black, shining, with plates people couldn't quite remember seeing. They smiled the way bank tellers smile and produced notebooks and questions with a politeness that felt like a hand on a shoulder pressing down. They had a way of knowing details not yet printed in the paper. A man who had seen red eyes above a hedgerow would have that exact hedgerow described back to him, the height and the thick place where the wild grape took over, as if the visitor had walked the yard themselves and left no print. A woman who reported a radio dying under a shadow would be asked about the station, the dial, the precise second-hand position on the kitchen clock when the silence fell. Their grammar sometimes misfired, a phrase a little off, like something learned phonetically, but their reassurance was fluent. We appreciate your cooperation. It would be best for everyone if this remained between us. Between who? Someone asked, resenting the whole of it. The man in the suit's smile did not change. Between those who understand. And if the visitors were questioned, what office did you say you were with? They would offer names that slid off the memory like oil. They never produced badges you could hold in your hand. They never left cards. When the door finally closed, the house felt colder than it had before they arrived. The dog would come out from beneath the table and refuse the hand it usually licked. There were phone calls too, with voices at the far end that sounded as if they were shuttled through machinery instead of copper, the syllables tinny, like words played on a music box. Sometimes there was only silence that felt intentional, and a faint beeping, not the high, urgent tone of hospital monitors, slower, patient, as if marking not heartbeats but some other interval. A witness would answer, say hello twice, and then hear their own name repeated in a voice they did not know. The line would go dead. At the phone company office, a man with a wrench and honest hands would test the lines and find nothing wrong he could fix. The valley had a parallel mystery track running that winter, a string of UFO reports threading towns up and down the Ohio. Lights that stopped then darted, discs that held still over fields like a second moon, objects that moved with a pilot's intention but not with any craft anyone there had flown or fueled. In one case, a traveling salesman sworn to his own good sense told anyone who'd listen that he had pulled his car to the shoulder near Parkersburg and met a smiling man who stepped out of the dark and began speaking with a gentle, rehearsed precision, asking about the lights, asking about the road, asking, of all things, about laughter, as if trying it on. The salesman managed to make the story sound both ridiculous and immovable. He was not asking for belief, he was describing a fact that had lodged in him like a splinter that the skin had decided to grow around. The newspapers, starved for copy in the slow weeks, flirted with the story, then folded it into the larger quilt. Into all of this walked a writer, John Keel **, with a notebook and the electric appetite peculiar to people who go where the static is thickest. He didn't treat Point Pleasant like a sideshow, he treated it like a window. To hear him tell it later, the Ohio Valley had become a kind of convergence zone, where boundaries thinned and everything, lights, creatures, dreams, rubbed against everything else and threw sparks. He took notes on the creatures' eyes, yes, but also on the odd phone calls, the doorstep courtesy of the men in suits, the way witnesses suffered afterward, the headaches, the nightmares, the sense of being observed even while doing ordinary chores like bringing in wood. He listened for patterns the way dowsers listen for water under stone. The number 13 turned up often enough to spook the already spooked. People dreamed in multiples of 3 knocks at the window, 3 shapes passing over the river, 3 days of silence before the next unease. A few described a package in their dreams, wrapped, string-tied, left on the porch, inside of which was only weight. When they lifted it, the floorboards groaned like a warning. Those same people would wake to the telephone ringing and a voice announcing a date that meant nothing to them yet, a date without month or day. Some wrote it down on envelopes and tucked the envelopes into Bibles as if scripture could steady it. When John Keel asked to see those envelopes, the handwriting had the peculiar steadiness people reserve for moments they assign significance to, like checks or marriage licenses. He took calls himself on hotel phones that clicked before the other party spoke, that delivered static like snow, that fed him fragments he would later arrange in the manner of a man assembling shards into the shape of a vessel. "Be careful on the river," a woman's voice told him once, and hung up. Another night a cheerful voice called him by name and recited a string of numbers in a tone people use for recipes. "What is this?" he asked, leaving the pencil where it was, "Midair." "You'll see," the voice said, and the line went black. He wasn't the only investigator, but he was the one who let the edges of the story stay ragged, who didn't sand them down with a single verdict. He used words like window area that made farmers squint but also made a certain middle distance inside their heads nod along. He seemed to understand the rule of the place, that whatever was happening had its own etiquette. It did not wish to be cornered by a word like monster. It preferred to be seen out of the corner of the eye, named in metaphor, handled like live wire. Meanwhile, the men in black worked the town like surveyors of a map that only they could see. One told a witness that the eyes of the creature were not eyes at all but lenses, as if the town had been looked at by something that needed to record. Another told a grocer that his son might have trouble getting to school if the grocer continued to talk. The grocer's wife stood in the doorway and stared at the man in the suit until his smile faltered by a millimeter. She said nothing, the way you say nothing when you are choosing the word that will keep a man alive. The man in the suit tipped his hat to no one and left. Some encounters were too strange to stick to daylight conversation. A young couple said two men in black coats came to their apartment and asked for water. When handed glasses, they raised them in unison and sipped as if they were learning how, the gesture exaggerated, the swallow carefully timed. Their questions were memorized questions. Their exit, when it came, was tidy. They closed the door gently, which the couple found more unnerving than a slam. The phone glitches worsened. A switchboard operator confessed in a low voice that lines she knew like the faces of her grandchildren had begun to act like strangers, calls would cross in ways their copper shouldn't allow, and once she heard a conversation moving on a wire that had no lights on her board. On a dull afternoon, she followed protocol and wrote it up. The report came back stamped with a word she'd never seen used for local phone trouble, anomalous. She put the word in her apron pocket and thought about it while she peeled potatoes that evening. Prophecies, no one called them that at first, started collecting. A boy woke from sleep and told his mother the bridge would groan like an old door, that the river would open, that people would fall and the water would swallow cars the way a field takes snow. She told him he had eaten too late and said a prayer without telling him she had said one. A man told his wife he had dreamed in white steel, white breath, white air, and that the number 46 had sat on the nightstand like a playing card. He didn't tell anyone else. He was superstitious about telling numbers. If all of this sounds like a mood trying to become a story, it was. But it was also particular, some days excruciatingly so. Witnesses wrote down times with the religious care of clerks. Keel kept binders. The sheriff's office, though it tried not to, developed procedures: who to send, which roads to check first, how to write down a report about a man with wings without smirking at the paper. The town had given itself over to a cataloging of the inexplicable, and in that catalog a pattern did begin to show: river, bridge, eyes, phone, suit, warning. And warnings, once spoken, work like hooks. Churches began to fill a little fuller on Wednesdays, not because pastors preached about winged omens but because people preferred company under a roof that had rules. In coffee shops, a mechanic would put down his cup and swear that whatever the thing was, it was not here to feed. "Look at it plain," he said. "We'd have bodies." A baker shook her head. "Maybe we're the bodies for something else," she said, meaning a story, a study, a ledger of reactions. Nobody laughed. Nobody argued. John Keel wrote letters to himself in the second person to keep his own head clear. * You are not to fall in love with the mystery. You are not to make it love you back. * He failed at both, of course. Anyone who has ever stood on a riverbank at night and felt a pressure of attention in the dark knows how quickly the mind makes marriage offers to any story that will make that attention make sense. He ordered more paper. He underlined too much. He began to mark the dates in a way that looks inevitable only in hindsight, a tightening spiral toward December. On some nights, the town felt almost calm, the calm of snow holding sound down, of kitchens warm with stews and the last can of summer peaches being opened just because someone needed sweetness now. On others, the air had that metallic taste again, that burn in the sinuses, that sense of being counted by something out beyond the porch. The bridge waited. The river moved. And so a question hung over Point Pleasant, quiet, insistent: was the Mothman a monster, or a messenger? Were the men in black harvesters of gossip, or custodians of an event not yet born? Was the static in the phone line a wiring problem, or a hand on the wire? The town did not agree. It didn't have to. Agreement doesn't stop weather, and what was coming felt like weather, not inevitable, but no longer avoidable. On the morning of December 15, 1967, the air was clear and sharp enough to cut. By late afternoon, the bridge was heavy with Christmas traffic, gifts in trunks, turkeys in foil, children fogging windows with their breath and drawing circles and hearts. At 5:04 p.m., something gave. And in December 1967, disaster struck, sealing Mothman's legend forever. In the last hour of daylight, December applies its own varnish to the Ohio, with every ripple turned to tarnish, every light doubled in the water. Friday, December 15, 1967, the town was in its familiar pre-holiday rhythm. On the West Virginia side, Main Street window displays were already set: cardboard snow, tin icicles, a painted Santa that made the glass feel warmer from inside than it looked from the street. On the Ohio side, Gallipolis had shoppers moving from pharmacy to five and dime, kids pressing mittened hands to toy shelves they'd memorized anyway. In between, suspended like a single thought connecting two minds, was the Silver Bridge. It had hung there since 1928, a bright promise in its first years, then a simple fact of life, like the river or the courthouse clock. A peculiar elegance to its design, those eye-bar chains, pairs of long steel plates with looped ends pinned together, pulling the roadway the way tendon pulls bone. It was handsome and felt light, the kind of engineering that makes a community think, unconsciously, that modernity is a trustworthy friend. For decades it was. Commuters crossed it twice a day without a second thought, teenagers counted girders to amuse a nervous passenger, deliverymen rolled across with the day's bread breathing through warm paper. By late afternoon the traffic was heavy the way traffic gets heavy when Christmas is near, trunks full, back seats loaded with coats, laughter running ahead of itself and bumping into silence, then back again. 5:04 p.m., the official time, because disasters set their own clocks. It had been cold all day, the kind of cold that scours sound, and people moving between stores felt the bridge's metal in their bones even if they couldn't have named the sensation. What survivors described afterward began as a shiver, not the human kind but a metallic tremor, a very slight judder that a few drivers mistook for the engine misfiring, or the wind shifting, or tires settling against the gridwork. Some heard a bang, not a single rifle crack, not exactly, but a sharp report as if something snapped in a place where nothing should snap. Others called it a pop, others a dull thud felt more than heard through the steering wheel. There's a moment in any failure when the thing still appears whole to the eye, but the shape is a lie. That moment passed with the speed of breath. A section near the Ohio shore, up in the web of steel where the eye-bar chain carried load like a shoulder carries a yoke, gave ****. The pin that should have sat quiet in its steel loop no longer had a loop to trust, one eye-bar fractured, the brake moving the way cracks move in glass, fast and unpersuadable. A system designed with too little redundancy did what such systems do. One failure became a different load in the next member, which became 2 failures, then 10, then a cascade. Witnesses saw the roadway pitch sideways. They saw the graceful arc kink. Someone described the towers as shuddering, not toppling, not yet, but shuddering as if they had taken a deep, involuntary breath. Then the deck went. The cars in that section, ordinary sedans, a pickup or two, a gasoline truck, tilted nose down in choreography no one would ever forget. Brake lights flared like a string of red punctuation marks and then disappeared, swallowed by a motion larger than any pedal or decision. The structures groaned, steel talking to itself in pain, rolled out across the water so that people 3 blocks inland looked up, baffled, as if the sky had cleared its throat. A bus driver who had paused in traffic felt his vehicle lurch and watched the railing nearest him peel away like ribbon. In another car, a father threw his right arm across his child in a reflex older than bridges or cars. The gesture did not matter to physics, but he would recall it later as if it had been a language and he had said the only useful word. A woman rolled her window down in the instant before the plunge because her mind snatched at one true thing: water. When the bridge dropped, drivers found themselves not falling into the river so much as riding the collapse, roadway vehicle, air, spray, all parts of a single, sickening sentence. The Ohio River took them fast, harder than it looks from the bank. December water does not bargain. People who survived spoke of the shock, not just cold but a kind of impact that made lungs forget how to inflate. Some fought the seat belt or door handle, some remembered to kick at glass, some clawed upward because upward was still a rule the body could understand. A man whose window wouldn't give pushed his shoulder against it until the pain made him angrier than the river. The glass surrendered. He surfaced into air that was already a tangle of voices, shouts from the bank, instructions shouted from no one in particular, prayers that were not addressed to anyone but carried anyway. Up on both approaches, cars braked and skidded, bumpers kissing bumpers as if each vehicle wanted to tell the next to stop in a language of metal. People left their engines running and ran toward the rip where the bridge had been. Some onlookers froze at the edge, caught in that terrible calculus: to jump and help is to risk becoming another body, to stay is to watch your own courage measured and found precise, or found wanting. Locals with boats, a pair of duck hunters, a man who kept a John boat for slow Saturdays, pushed into the chaos, oars biting water. Firemen from both sides sounded sirens that got swallowed by the open air and the stunned milling at the banks. The river foamed with air and debris, boards, paper, a red thermos, one green Christmas bag someone would later say belonged to a neighbor who had been on her way home from work. A man in a heavy coat had to let the coat go because it became a drag pulling him back under. The coat spun away like a slow animal. A woman reached the surface and could not find west or east. The bridge's absence was a new geography. She found the shore by the smell of exhaust and hot brakes, the smell of the living. On the banks, people made themselves useful in sudden new professions: rope holders, ladder bringers, shouters of good advice, shouters to shut up. An off-duty nurse took charge of a patch of concrete and turned it into a triage line with blankets conjured from car trunks. A man took the names of the ones who could speak. Someone tried to call loved ones and got the operator because half the city had the same thought: the lines jammed. In kitchens, dinner plates went cold while phone trees bloomed into confusion. A mother told a child they were just going for a ride to see the river and then, when they arrived, told the child to stay in the car. The child stared at the place where the bridge wasn't and wrote the shape of the gap into memory as if with a nail. Night comes early in December. The scene changed temperature again when the dark arrived: more lights, more steam from the rescue engines, more breath visible as if the town itself were panting. Television crews from larger cities began to appear, squinting into viewfinders, shouldering past people who had lived their whole lives here and had never seen so many professionals at once. The camera lights made a stage out of crisis, bleaching the edges of the water to a cruel white. Divers, some from the National Guard, some from local companies, arrived with gear that glinted and aired itself in small hisses. They went into water that hates bodies and came back with news in the shape of numbers. Those numbers grew into a count the town did not want to know and knew anyway: 46 dead, the worst bridge disaster in the country to that date. The investigation would come later: men with clipboards and calm questions, pieces of steel laid on tables like bones, photographs annotated with arrows and measurements. They would say what steel and stress and time together will sometimes say: that an eye bar had fractured, likely from a tiny defect that the early 20th century hadn't easily found, that a chain designed without adequate backup had no margin for a single failure. In the end, the sentence would be crisp and technical, a single component failure in a non-redundant suspension system. The language was antiseptic, as it must be, so that future bridges would not become future elegies. But the town heard another sentence under it: the thing we trusted failed us all at once. Grief rearranged Point Pleasant. In the days after, churches filled without announcements. The paper printed names in columns that made the page look like it had been mortally wounded. Funerals stacked themselves on the calendar until the calendar became meaningless. People crossed the river by ferry or detoured long miles, their backs remembering the span that was no more. On certain nights the river looked too still, as if it were holding its breath even now, decades later. And threaded through that suffering was the story that had already been living here: the eyes in the dark, the chase on Route 62, the figure on rooftops and at windows. People did not say, "I told you so." They said, with the caution of people speaking near sleeping children, ***, maybe it was a warning ***. The Mothman, in this telling, had not been the cause but the omen, a messenger to a town that did not know how to listen to steel but did know how to listen to stories. Some witnesses did not welcome the link, they hadn't asked for this creature to become the decal attached forever to a night of loss. Others found that framing was the only way the world made sense. Monster or messenger, each word caught a different light and reflected it into a different house. Reporters who had come for spectacle learned how to lower their voices. One man from out of state asked a grieving mother about prophecy and earned a silence that burned. The town developed a twin etiquette: speak plainly of the dead, and if you must speak of the winged thing, fold your voice as you would a flag. In that folding, the legend took on the weight of ritual. People put flowers at the river. Someone left a small note near the shore: **, we saw you. We didn't understand, **, the paper did not print that, but word of the note made its rounds anyway, because the valley is good at carrying words. For months, divers still found metal and the last answers the river would deliver. Then the river did what rivers do, returned to its work, broad and indifferent, carrying tugboats and the reflections of two towns that had been forced to regard each other over a new kind of distance. The replacement bridge would come in time, built with lessons learned, the wound bridged but not undone. People who had nothing to do with steel design nonetheless learned a phrase about redundancy and did not forget it. The story of the Mothman learned a different word: omen. From disaster, folklore took root, blending grief and myth. In the months after the collapse, the town wore its mourning like a coat that could not be taken off. The Silver Bridge lived on in photographs and engineering diagrams, in eulogies and in the new caution with which people regarded steel. But another narrative threaded itself through the grief, quieter at first, then persistent, the one with red eyes and folded wings, with a winter of sightings that refused to dissolve in the solvent of time. Tragedy and story do not always share a table. In Point Pleasant, they learned to. The first transformation was not a carnival but a kind of archive. People who had notebooks full of times and dates, the sheriff's office, John Keel, a handful of local reporters, found themselves keepers of testimony that now felt like evidence of something larger than a series of scares. Keel left the valley with binders and returned to New York, where he turned interviews, clippings, and late-night phone calls into a narrative with its own unhurried gravity. In 1975, he published The Mothman Prophecies, neither a simple monster book nor a simple debunking, but a documentary of strangeness that folded the men in black, UFO reports, prophetic dreams, and the bridge into a single, unsettling frame. Keel's voice offered the story permission to be complex, to resist tidy either-or verdicts. He suggested window areas and convergences, ideas that sat comfortably in the American 1970s alongside Cold War unease and the new habit of distrusting any story with only one author. In living rooms far from the Ohio Valley, readers who had never stood on the riverbank felt the weight of Point Pleasant's winter. They closed the book with a sensation not of having solved anything but of having witnessed. For locals, the book was a double-edged tool, a reminder they were not crazy, and a mirror that sometimes made them wince. But mirrors are a kind of respect, the valley learned to accept it. The second transformation belonged to the screen. In 2002, a Hollywood adaptation of Keel's book, ******* The Mothman Prophecies*****, brought Richard Gere and Laura Linney to the shadowed corners of a reimagined Point Pleasant. Films, unlike books, give you sound and face, they offer the texture of dread, phone lines with a taste of metal, river fog that rolls like a sentence finishing itself. Audiences met the legend in theaters, and many of them went home to their own river towns and turned off a lamp a little more slowly than usual. The movie did not pretend to be a documentary, it traded some fact for atmosphere. But atmosphere is a carrier wave. The name Mothman moved from cryptid circles into the broader lexicon, and the valley felt the curious draft of distant eyes turning toward it. Between book and film, something else happened on the street level, the kind of reorganization only small towns manage with both practicality and ceremony. In 2002, Point Pleasant hosted the first Mothman Festival, a weekend where grief and legend could coexist in public without canceling each other. At first it was modest, a few vendors, a speaker or two, a handful of witness panels, some homemade art that took the feared outline and rendered it in paint, plush, iron, and ink. Over the years it grew into a ritual with pilgrims from counties no map would join, then from states farther out, then from countries farther still. Main Street filled with booths selling t-shirts and books, cryptozoology talks, guided walks to the TNT area, and the particular conviviality of people who came to compare gooseflesh and beliefs without needing to convert each other. If you stand at the festival's edge, you can watch three Americas overlap. First is the solemn one, people who drift toward a display about the Silver Bridge, read the names, and fall quiet, the festival gives them a place to remember together. Second is the playful one, teenagers posing with red-eye contact lenses, a kid in cardboard wings, a baker selling Mothman cookies with crimson icing dots, a brass band that can't resist quoting a comic book theme before settling into a hymn. Third is the curious middle, visitors who came for a weekend and find themselves asking earnest questions at the museum without quite knowing why their voice is lower. The museum itself, the Mothman Museum, opened its doors in 2005, a small but meticulous space curated with clippings, original police reports, witness sketches, and the kind of everyday artifacts that prove a story lived in ordinary hands. You can trace the winter of 1966-67 in newspaper fonts and pencil notations, you can see how Keel interviewed, how the sheriff typed, how a witness drew what they had no name for. It's not a haunted house. It's a filing cabinet made public. The room has a hush that museums always have, the respect we lend to paper, cut now and then by the laughter of someone who has just found a button or an old photograph and recognized a face. In a corner, there's a television looping clips, talk shows, local documentaries, footage of a town making itself legible to outsiders. A statue presides nearby, installed in 2003, the stainless steel Mothman with a gladiatorial glamour, faceted body, wings lifted, eyes round and red. Sculpted by Bob Roach, it takes a figure that once lived in the periphery and pins it to daylight, stainless and undeniable. Tourists pose at its feet, brides and grooms have taken wedding photos there, the creature's grin throwing a peculiar blessing over the day. Some locals shook their heads when the statue went up, others felt a strange relief, as if naming the thing with metal finally let the air out of a long-held breath. Art can do that, interrupt a haunting by fixing it to a plinth. But even in celebration, the valley keeps its argument alive, as healthy places do. Some residents say the festival and museum have cheapened a sorrow, that selling the legend turns the bridge into a backdrop. Others answer that the choice was never between forgetting and exploiting, but between letting the story be told badly from the outside and telling it honestly at home. The compromise is visible if you're paying attention. The festival map routes visitors past the memorial, speakers pause to say names, docents learn to answer questions about engineering as readily as questions about omens. A town can walk and chew memory at the same time. The story also escaped into the wider American imagination in other ways. Novelists borrowed the red eyes for a chapter and gave them back. Musicians wrote songs that folded the Mothman into choruses about loss, roads, and weather. Television's appetite for unsolved mysteries guaranteed a rotation of docu-series episodes that would revisit Point Pleasant every few years, updating nothing and updating everything by moving the story forward through time. Video games and comics found in the legend a ready-made silhouette, wings that cast a good shadow over a rural plot. Each retelling adjusted the ratio of fright to reverence to fun, the sum, however imperfect, made certain that Point Pleasant would never again be only a name on a river map. And still, when the crowds go home and the festival tents fold, Point Pleasant returns to itself. The river holds its slow conversation with the banks. The replacement bridge stands, more robust, more redundant, designed with the lessons of failure, and carries the same ordinary burdens: commuters, gossip, groceries, quiet thoughts. In the TNT area, cattails click in the breeze, the old igloos keep their echo. Teens still go there to scare themselves on purpose, hunters still move carefully along the marsh edges, a few visitors ease down gravel roads and feel their pulse increase for no good reason. Time has lent the Mothman a second vocabulary, symbol ***. In the Appalachian Gothic that outsiders love to name but locals simply live, the creature has come to stand for a cluster of linked feelings: the anxiety of economies that slip while no one is looking, the suspicion that the government knows more than it tells, the resilience of river towns that bury their dead and make coffee anyway the next day. The red eyes are not only a fright, they are a mirror for the way a community watches itself in seasons of fear. The wings are not only a threat, they are a reminder of what can arrive, sudden, uninvited, and insist on being reckoned with. Walk Main Street on a weekday morning and you'll see how the legend has been domesticated without being defanged. A coffee shop sells a red-eye roast. A bookstore shelf mingles Keel with county histories. A hardware store window holds a child's drawing of a bridge and, above it, two red dots that are either Christmas bulbs or something else. Across the street, a bulletin board advertises a memorial service with simple serif type. Commerce and commemoration share the glass. The town's docents and old-timers have developed a rhythm for conversation with strangers. They begin with 1966, with the gravediggers, with the TNT chase. They pause at December 15, 1967 and let the silence lead. Then, if the listener is patient, they will talk about how the story grew, into Keel's book, into the film, into the festival, into the statue, and how none of those things, by themselves, answer the original question. They gesture toward the river. They tilt a head toward the trees. They speak, finally, not of proof but of meaning. Because this is what folklore does when it grows up inside a wound, it becomes not an explanation, but a frame. It gives people a way to hang emotions where they can look at them without being blinded. It permits the living to ask the two questions grief always leaves behind: what happened, and what did it mean? The first has an engineering answer inscribed in textbooks and safety codes. The second belongs to the town, to its storytellers, to the children who will someday ask their grandparents why that statue has eyes like coals and wings like a storm. And yet, folklore, however carefully tended, can only circle. It cannot go back to the night roads of 1966 and sit in a parked car with a racing heart and the hot certainty of being watched. It cannot ride the 100-mile-an-hour panic down Route 62. It cannot stand at a kitchen door and raise a porch light against a shape that does not move. For that, we must return to the witnesses, to the unglamorous honesty of people who were not looking for a story and found one anyway. But folklore doesn't answer the deeper question: what did the witnesses really see? A legend's last act is not to convince you, it is to stay. To remain when the electricity bill comes due, when the fields need cutting, when the fairy horn turns the river into a throat that sings. And this is how the Mothman endures in Point Pleasant, as a presence measured not only by sightings or clippings, but by the way people glance toward the treeline a fraction longer than necessary. The skeptics have their ledger, and it is a formidable one. They open to the pages that list sandhill cranes, migratory, tall enough to loom in the mind of a startled witness, their red facial skin capable of looking like lanterns in a headlight's glare. They note great horned owls, masters of the perch and stare, whose silhouette on a roofline can be mistaken for a hunched figure and whose eyeshine can daub a bloody red onto the night. They bring photographs, measurements, wingspans, and the cool comfort of taxonomy, which says, sensibly, that when we are frightened, we often oversize the ordinary and assign to it a will it does not possess. They do not stop there. They open the chapter on mass suggestion, not hysteria exactly, which insults witnesses, but the subtler phenomenon by which a community under stress develops a shared vocabulary for unease. Industrial decline, Cold War dread, the bridge that would collapse, a trifecta that could prime the mind to pattern-seek in the dark. The skeptics point out how headlines can crystallize a fuzz of stories into a single shape. Name it Mothman, and you have given fear a coat, and fear will happily wear it. And yet, there is another ledger. The believers don't all agree with one another, but they agree on this much, that what happened in 1966 to 67 does not compress neatly into a crane's wingspan or the psychology of a decade. For some, Mothman is exactly what the newspapers called him, a monster, an apex presence that slipped across a boundary and took the night roads for a while. For others, he was an omen, not the cause of the Silver Bridge disaster but its shadow, the way thunder belongs to lightning even if it arrives later. A few speak of messengers and windows, Keel's language, hinting at a cosmos in which certain places thin until the ordinary world leaks. There are the prophetic dreams to account for, the phone anomalies, the men in black whose smiles sat wrong on their faces, the car engines that died under a moving silence. Each of these is defeatable alone, the way a single ant can be pressed with a thumb. Together, they become a trail that refuses to wash out. When the argument grows warm, one side says, "Find me a body," and the other answers, "We already have 46. To some, that is an unfair conflation. To others, it is a line of grief that cannot, must not, be severed. In the local telling, the Mothman's eyes are the anchor. Mere eyes would reflect, these seem to regard. The glow is reported as self-generated, as if something looked through the witnesses, not at them. It is a small semantic difference with a large footprint. If you have ever stood in a cemetery at dusk and felt watched by your own imagination, you know the difference between projecting a gaze and being caught in one. The witnesses insist on the latter. It looked, they say. It looked in a way that forced a vertical line straight through your animal brain and into something older. What, then, does it mean? Here the story turns from cryptozoology to Appalachian Gothic, a mood that outsiders file under spooky, but locals understand as a grammar for thinking about loss. The region's Gothic is not castles and capes, it is porches and floodplains, the hush that falls on a holler when the wind changes, the sense that the land keeps a ledger of violence and mercy both. In that grammar, the Mothman becomes a metaphor that refuses to confess itself as only metaphor. He is the face the town gave to a cluster of truths, that infrastructure fails, that governments withhold, that grief will draft any available shape to move through a body. A symbol, if it survives long enough, learns to split. The festival Mothman, bright-eyed, stainless, self-ready, coexists with the night Mothman, the one who sits at the end of a bed in memory and makes the room contract by a foot on each side. One sells cookies and spreads hotel revenue across a fragile economy. The other remains a private weather system inside a witness's chest. If the two irritate each other, that irritation is productive, it keeps the town honest. It says, we are allowed to laugh and we are required to bow our heads. Critics sometimes argue that stories like this impede progress, that they turn rural places toward superstition. But in Point Pleasant, the legend has done an odd, practical work. It has kept the bridge in the town's mouth, not as a wound to pick until it bleeds, but as a lesson etched in ritual. Children who have their picture taken under the stainless steel wings also learn the new words, bar, redundancy, fatigue. They grow up knowing that steel is not a god, that maintenance is an ethic, that remembering is a kind of safety. If a cryptid is the price of that civic memory, the bargain is not foolish. Meanwhile, the TNT area sleeps and wakes as it always has. In late autumn, when the reeds dry and rattle like bones telling a joke, you can imagine the igloos breathing. Teenagers go to scare themselves, hunters say the deer move differently on certain nights. Now and then a visitor parks, kills the headlights, and waits for the strange privilege of seeing something they cannot explain. Most nights, nothing presents itself. The night has the right to keep its privacy. On other nights, there is a shape, not because the shape insists on being seen, but because looking long into dark surface creates in it the suggestion of depth. Even then, the visitor will carry the sighting away with doubt sitting on the dashboard like a saint statue. Belief and skepticism, elbow to elbow, riding home together. What is left for us to do with the Mothman? If we are stern, we may conclude he was a chain of misidentifications. If we are credulous, we may make a chapel of him. The healthier act is witness, to admit that a town under strain experienced a season of the uncanny, and that the experience mattered, shaping how Point Pleasant carries its dead and greets its future. Proof is a word for laboratories and courts. Meaning is what kitchens are for. In kitchens, the story lives. Listen to how people tell it now. A grandmother at a picnic table says, "Back then, your Aunt Linda saw, well, she saw," and she leaves a space where the word would go. A former deputy says, "I took a lot of calls," and lets you hear in his voice how the night used to press on him from both sides of the windshield. A stranger from a city you've never visited asks a barista where the museum is, and the barista points and adds, "Because she cannot help it, and if you go, don't forget the Bridge Memorial." These are not lines from a ghost tour. They are civic speech, the way a community agrees, without voting, to hold more than one truth at once. Every legend needs its final image, not to end the story, but to grant it a place to rest. Here is one for Point Pleasant, a winter evening, the river laying a sheet of pewter under a half-moon. On Main Street, the statue throws its glittering shadow across the concrete. Tourists have gone, the storefronts have gone skylight dark. Somewhere beyond town, in the reeds, a shape lifts, no thunderclap of wings, just the suggestion of volume moving through colder air. 2 points hang a moment above the brush, accruing a red the human eye cannot quite calibrate between menace and warning. They pause, as if to ask whether anyone who needs to see is ready, and then they go. The Mothman of Point Pleasant remains less about what it was and more about what it meant, a harbinger for some, a mirror for others, a grammar by which a town told the truth about fear, grief, and endurance. Some stories land, give up their secrets, and grow quiet. This one never quite lands. It keeps flying, low over a town that learned to live with both steel and shadow, both evidence and omen, both the weight of names carved in stone and the lightness of wings that refuse to be weighed at all.